Good day, everyone, and welcome to another episode of What's Really Happening. I'm Dr. Tad Schnoffer, Strategy and Research Manager here at the Global and National Security Institute at the University of South Florida. As always, we're joined by GNSI's Executive Director, retired U.S. Marine Corps General Frank McKenzie, as we explore global and national security issues. What's Really Happening will take you behind the scenes and open the door to the knowledge, experiences, and insights of a senior leader who has command at the highest level of the U.S. military, including commanding U.S. Central Command. Recently, the Houthi attacks on shipping in the region has caused shipping companies to reroute their ships around the Cape of Good Hope on the southern tip of Africa and increase insurance costs for those ships willing to risk the voyage. With 17,000 ships passing through the strait each year, ensuring safe passage is a daunting challenge. Let's check in with General McKenzie and see how U.S. Central Command has dealt with these challenges. Welcome back, General.
Good to be here today, Ted.
Sir, so what's the importance of the Strait of the Bab-el-Mandeb to Central Command particularly?
So, Tad, the Bab-el-Mandeb is actually the Suez Canal.
Right.
If you're going to go through the Suez Canal, you're going to go through the Bab-el-Mandeb, or as it was known for many years in CENTCOM lingo, the Barbara Mandrel. So it's absolutely important. It's one of the three key choke points in the Central Command region: the Suez Canal, the Bab-el-Mandeb, and of course the Strait of Hormuz. And it lies on the boundary of Central Command and Africa Command. Mm-hmm. People ask me all the time, is that a problem? Because, there used to be a famous saying in the British Army, they fight all their battles at the intersection of four map sheets, uphill and in the rain.
Right.
And so actually it's not. We have a very good relationship with Africa Command. Forces are swapped back and forth seamlessly. Commanders talk all the time at the 3-star level, then at lower levels as well. So no, it's not. It is not a problem, but there are good procedures in place to ensure that there's no friction.
Well, in looking at the strait, we talked about the physical dimensions in the in-brief before we started our discussion here. Looking around the area, let's talk about some of the countries that border it. So Eritrea, kind of, noted as the North Korea of Africa. So what role do they play in the strait and the Red Sea in general?
So not anything particularly useful.
Right.
Generation of piracy from there. Mm-hmm. But aside from that, they're of no greater significance than that.
Right. And that's pretty much how it is in the news as well from there. But if we do go just next door, we have a former French colony of Djibouti, which has military bases from China, China's first overseas military base, Japan's only overseas military base for its defense forces. The U.S. has a base there as well. And we see is the strategic location coming up again and again. So what role does Djibouti play in the strait?
Djibouti is very important. We use it, as you noted, as a base. Mm-hmm. Friends and others use it as a base as well. Mm-hmm. It's important because we also base other kinds of maritime reconnaissance aircraft there. It's a good runway there. Mm-hmm. So it's a very useful place for us. Now, it's in, of course, Africa's AOR, but we use it. CENTCOM uses it. We have a good arrangement with them. But it's a great forward logistics base. So if we have ships down there that are patrolling, it's a great place to resupply them from. So it does all the things you'd want from a forward logistics base. It's Djibouti is a very important base for us.
Right, and very interesting with all those different countries having bases there. I think the Italians also have a base there. I mean,
geography is destiny, Tad, and Djibouti is destined to be very important because of its proximity to the Bab-el-Mandeb.
Well, and conveniently, it's also very stable compared to its neighbors.
It is. You're right, Ted.
Yeah. And as we continue down the coast, we go to Somaliland or Somalia, where obviously for a few years, particularly 2007 to 2008, up into the 2010s, there's large piracy up into the Gulf of Aden and then the Strait. What was going on during that period?
Well, it's a fractured country. It's a failed country. It's a tragedy. We go back to our tragedy there in 1993 with Black Hawk Down. So it's a classic example of a failed state in Africa that has been overrun by interests that are not concerned about the people there,
right.
That pursue their own goals, political and otherwise. Some are simple criminals. Some have bizarre political goals, and they clash. But they can project power out to sea, and that's where you get the piracy problem. It's a lucrative business, and so as a result, shipping lanes tend to stand way out when they come around the Horn of Africa to avoid getting into that belt of problems.
And that piracy problem from Somalia was dealt with by a large coalition, U.S.-led coalition and naval coalition during that period, and was mostly resolved. The numbers were cut down, but we see now with Yemen that attacks on shipping has increased. In this case, not necessarily piracy, but missile attacks. kind of stemming out of the Yemeni civil war. So what's the difference and what's the motivations with those attacks?
Well, in Yemen, first of all, you're closer to major shipping lanes. It's easier to get to it than from Somalia.
Right.
I don't want to. If you look at a map, Somalia is a little further to the south. But if you're going to transit the Bab-el-Mandeb, you're going to approach very close to Yemen in a variety of different ways, both on the east side, on the west side, as you clear it. So there's a lot more opportunity for groups in Yemen to actually reach out and touch shipping. And the Houthis see the value of that, but also other groups not under Houthi control have seen the value of that. So as usual, you get a mixture of semi-state, state, and simple criminal elements that operate at sea against these ships.
Sure, and going back to the civil war in Yemen, it starts in 2014. The war ends up spreading, and then the Houthi rebels end up taking the shoreline on the strait. At the time, I was serving as company commander in Djibouti in 2016, where the U.S. launched its first Tomahawk rockets against radar sites in the region. And it seemed like those attacks actually deterred the Houthis for a while of attacking in the straits, if you recall that time.
Chad, when that happened, I was actually up on the joint staff. I was the J5, the strategic planner for General Dunford, the chairman. And yes, I believe they did actually calm things down. A lesson we should perhaps have heeded about the utility of early action on something like this. It's better to deal with it early rather than let it fester. And we'll talk about it in a moment, but we've let the problem there fester until it's gotten to really global proportions now.
Right, because you had those 2016 attacks, and then the U.S. responded with a number of retaliatory attacks, and then also some Navy SEAL attacks and things on the ground, actually raids, famously in Yemen. But after that, it was relatively silent for the region, and then now we have the current crisis with the Yemenis and the Houthis, the Houthi rebels, firing rockets into the Strait, as well as the Red Sea and then the Gulf of Aden. So what's the difference this time, and why is it so much more intense than it was prior?
So the Houthis now have a greater degree of control. They still only control a fraction of the country, but they control that fraction of the country that actually confronts the Red Sea in the west and down to toward the Strait of Bab-el-Mandeb in the south. So they own some critical ground. Not all of the ground, but enough to make it worrisome. Second, the Houthis have a really strong ideological bias to destroy Israel and to destroy the United States. They say that's fundamental to their worldview. We should take their word for that and believe them when they say it. And so, as a result of the war in Gaza, they have taken action to attack Israel, which has not proved effective. The Houthis are actually pretty good engineers. The weapons that they using to fire they don't originate from Yemen. Clearly, they come from Iran, and they're brought down on dhows and other methods of transport. But the Houthis have been very effective in re-engineering those weapons and making them better. Despite this, they've not been able to put together something that can effectively strike into Israel. The distance is just too long, their weapons are too unsophisticated, and Israeli defenses are too good. However, they still want to strike at Israel. So if you can't do that, the next best thing to do is to attack indiscriminately shipping in the Strait of Bab-el-Mandeb and to claim that you're doing it to get back at Israel. Although they're attacking anything, they're not really paying much attention to who those ships are with or who they're flagged under. And because the ranges are much shorter there, they're having more effect. And of course, it doesn't take much damage to ships to cause insurance underwriters to refuse to insure ships that go through that passage. And that has a profound effect on global trade. Because now, if you're not allowed to go through the Bab-el-Mandeb, which means you're not allowed to go through the Suez Canal, it means you've got to go around the Cape of Good Hope. You've got to go around South Africa. And that's a much longer, can be 10 to 14 days additional transit time. There are also weather conditions that obtain. It's not the passage that you'd want. The Suez Canal is there for a reason.
Right. And the strait ends up getting about 17,000 ships through it every year, and it's only about 20 miles wide. So the range is relatively short from Yemen, from the Yemen east coast across the
Chad,
strait.
I've been through that strait many times on ships. It is very narrow.
Right.
You get a good look at Yemen as you go past.
Right, and they're looking back apparently.
They're looking back.
Yes, sir. And obviously, the U.S. has now responded with a U.S.-led coalition in the Red Sea and the Gulf of Aden, responding to the Houthi attacks there. And the U.S. is launching strikes across the region in retaliation for a number of Iranian-backed militia group attacks. What does that look like for the U.S. going forward in Yemen particularly?
Well, I think it's important to realize, Tad, that we've said in our national security strategy that the Bab-el-Mandeb is key strategic terrain, and it needs to stay open. So we're being true to our strategic view of the world, which is that we're a maritime nation, essentially. We need freedom of passage on the global commons. The Houthis have stopped this. And so that is a critical blow at the very heart of of our view of what security in the world means. So I think this is a very high priority. And I agree, this has nothing to do with us about the war in Gaza. It has to do with a free right of passage at sea. So we've actually, I think this is a very, very important task we've set ourselves to do. Now, I think we began it by telegraphing that we were going to do it, which allowed the Houthis perhaps to avoid some of the effects of the first strike. That's unfortunate, not actually the way you want to do it.
Right.
You might want to hit them first and then talk about it, but that's okay. Strikes continue. Ted, I believe the Houthis have a finite pool of weapons.
Right.
Short-range ballistic missiles, cruise missiles, probably some short-range rockets, and some other tools, unmanned aerial vehicles that they can employ. These weapons were all brought in from Iran, retooled, re-engineered, upgraded, in Yemen. They're guided by crude radars, by intelligence assets, and by Iranian shipping that helps them with their targeting. But there's a finite pool of these. We should be able to reduce that pool significantly. Additionally, the other aspect of what's going on there is we must reduce the ability of Iran to reinforce them with more missiles and weapons. They come by sea in dhows and other vessels, and they come through Oman. And we need to have a conversation with the Omanis, who have been very good partners to us on a number of things about cracking down on the flow of Iranian illicit arms material, lethal material, that goes through Oman and into Yemen. We need to prevent that. We need to slow it down. If we do those things, one or two things will happen. Either the Houthis will not have the weapons to strike, or ideally, you'd convince the Houthis that this is not a path they want to go down, because if they go down it, we're eventually going to take away all of their capabilities. They worked very hard to build these capabilities up. So it's a stark choice that they face.
Right.
But in order to do that, we have to keep the pressure on. We have to keep striking. And that's not going to be something that's going to be done in the matter of a day or two or even a week or two. It's going to take some time to get there. We do have the ability to do it.
So if the U.S. is going to be able to limit the shipment of arms to the Yemenis, or the Houthis rather, what other actors are going to be in place? We talked about Oman, but what about Saudi Arabia? They were involved aggressively in the beginning of the civil war. What role
Sure,
will they
you'd
play?
like to see the involvement of Saudi Arabia, UAE, other countries in the region, but you'd also like to see involvement of countries who depend on the Bab-el-Mandeb for movement of their oil resources, such as Japan, the United Kingdom, who is helping us in these strikes right now, but other nations that use that vital choke point as a key passage for their goods, trades, and oil. So it is really genuinely a global problem, not a regional problem.
Sure, and because the U.S. actually doesn't get the majority of its oil from the region at all.
We don't, and so the Bab-el-Mandeb is not as critical to us as it is to others, but the principle is very important to the United States because of other straits, such as the Strait of Taiwan, where we might, where others are looking at us and seeing how we respond to this, to see how it might apply to other places. They're looking at this, the Iranians are looking at this up in the Strait of Hormuz as well. So there are other places that will derive lessons from how we are able to reassert free right passage here in the Bab-el-Mandeb.
So is the U.S. really, in the Middle East, having to execute multiple different types of policies against the Houthis, and then also supporting Israel, but also Iranian-backed militia groups in Syria? How's it able to juggle all those different policy implementations?
I think we have to be able to do that, but we're a global power. We should be able to do it. We should be able to execute a policy with Israel and Hamas. We should be able to execute a policy against the Houthis that is largely based on freedom of navigation. And we should be able to execute our policy of our agreement with Iraq that our forces are going to remain there, and the good our forces do up in Syria. All this requires a nuanced, separate approach. But the one point I would make, behind most of this lies one nation. That one nation is Iran. And we should remember that as we work this problem.
And as we look to the future for U.S. policymakers, what tool using in the Middle East would likely get the most out of it when it comes to either making the Houthis back down or Iran?
Well, let's talk about the Houthis. I think right now it's the military element of power. We have to convince them that they're not going to be able to attain their goal through violence. And we have a much larger reservoir of violence to bring to the problem. And they have a very limited pool of resources when all is said and done. They can choose to have all of their resources destroyed, or they can choose to negotiate something before they lose all those resources. But either way, we should be relentless and irresistible as we establish freedom of passage to the Bab-el-Mandeb, a vital national security interest for the United States.
Sure, and to note that Yemen's still in a civil war, so they're also still fighting in other places. So.
Absolutely, and we need to recognize that as well.
Absolutely. Well, thank you so much, sir, for being with us today.
Ted, good to be here today. Thank you.
And that's going to wrap up another episode of What's Really Happening, with an insightful discussion on the Strait of Bab-el-Mandeb with our GNSI Executive Director, retired U.S. Marine Corps General Frank McKenzie. I'm Dr. Tat Schnoffer here at the Global and National Security Institute at the University of South Florida. Thanks for joining us today, and we look forward to next time when we find out what's really happening.